Okay, so this is a bit of a break from the rest of the lectures that we've had so far. So we've had a talk about theropods in general. I focused us in a little bit more closely on the relationship between theropods and birds, I should say, and hopefully convinced you that birds are a very derived group of theropods. And now I'm going to break away from that, and we're going to talk about the appearance of dinosaurs and the evolution of feathers within the lineage, because it's fairly important to our understanding. The reason we wait until now, of course, is I wanted to introduce theropods because we know quite a bit about at least derived theropod appearances. So I wanted us to get into that. But what we don't know, of course, is what do primitive members of the group look like? How did they look compared to these more advanced groups? And so today that's what we're going to do. And it's going to be, hopefully, up until this point in the class, I've been telling you what dinosaurs should look like. I've been evaluating whether the artist has produced a reasonable image of that dinosaur, and you've been able to say, okay, that sounds good to me. But you haven't yet had the tools to examine it yourself. And so today what this lecture is going to provide you with is the information that will let you evaluate whether, the dinosaur's appearance in this image reflective of what we currently know is the best science, or is it an older style and therefore it's probably outdated in these ways. Okay? And the appearance of this is also important for this field trip because one of the questions on the sheet that I gave you guys deals with what would you do to update modern, the specimens are currently at, well, they're not specimens, but I should say that the casts of animals that are currently at the museum. Because they are an older style, and once you get there, you'll realize that they're an older style, and that's fine. That's what happens. We don't, every day, we don't get to go out and recast new animals, right? We don't get to recommission artists every week because some new information comes out. But it's good to start thinking about what that would look like. And it's also important because that's the way we inform the public, right? So we're lagging in the museum setting, of course. We have to. We simply can't turn over exhibits that quickly. But that's where the public is getting information about appearances. And so we are also, as much as is reasonable, trying to come up with ways to connect those, right? To try to reduce that lag time in some way. Now, a lot of these animals you'll have already seen in this course, right? We spend a lot of time dealing with it a group by group basis, and we're going to jump back to that on Monday. But you'll have seen many of the similarities here. This, of course, is a primitive member of the, which group? Yes, this is Thracian. Yep. So this is not the Thracians, of the Ornithischians. This is a primitive duckbill, basically, right? This is that Heterodontosaurus. And one of the things that we get from the fossil is, well, we're pretty comfortable saying that it's bipedal. That's somewhat obvious to us just by the length of the legs, right? You can measure legs, you can measure arms, you can compare the two to one another. If they're really disproportionate, different in length, that gives you some information about whether the animal could walk on all four or on just two legs. And so, at least from the fossils, it seems relatively easy to reconstruct animals like this as bipedal. But the bones are only really one very small component of the appearance of an animal. The bones of a human will give you only a very primitive understanding of what humans actually look like. Think about the diversity in this room that is not contained in bones, right? Our skeletons would actually be very similar. But our appearances, in fact, are fairly varied, right? It wouldn't be hard for you to pick people out in this group and say, these people are different. In fact, humans really only have a problem when we get down to identical twins, and even there we're oftentimes able to tell people apart. So the differences in these animals, right, is really, we're going to look outside the bones because we're not going to get as much information there about it. So this is two ways to portray that animal. The one on the bottom is, of course, your more classical view of dinosaurs. And in this way, an artist is looking at a dinosaur and saying, well, they belong to a group of reptiles. I'm going to put that in quotes, right? Reptilia. If we define it really within the diapsids, then that's all right. But if we bring it out further, then we have some other issues. But the reptiles in this way, well, what do reptiles look like? Well, they're scaly, and I like to think of them as greenish. And they often have really noticeably large scales around exposed areas that would run into things. Again, not dissimilar, to protect them, not dissimilar from bird legs to some degree. But if you think about birds, of course, which are nested now deeply within the diapsid tree, what do they look like? Well, they look very different. It's a very different animal, an element to itself. And birds really look like a completely different beast. And so if you say, well, this animal is probably more bird-like in appearance, then your first instinct is to say, well, then it should be covered in feathers, right? It should have some feathery coverage on that body. Now, we'll have to talk about if these animals actually have feathers or not, but we would tend to go towards the top picture. And the other thing, again, about the top picture is it also reflects some understanding about that birds, at least, are very attuned to color. Right? And so we should expect dinosaurs to be colorful. We shouldn't say to artists they should be black and brown and green, right? That's possible. There are black, brown, green birds out there, right? All these things exist. But we also see a lot of diversity within that, in the color patterns of those animals as well. So maybe that's more reflective of dinosaurs. And the animal at top is probably, we think now, closer to what we would expect to see. This is Eoraptor. This guy, remember, is a very primitive sauropod. Well, it's not a sauropod, but it belongs to that lineage of the Sauropelta. And so it has some of those characteristics. Again, how would you draw this thing? In a more classical way, you would draw it. This is a particularly bad version of this, but you would draw it like this. There's a couple things that are really obnoxious about this that I hate. One, scales on dinosaurs are absolutely not hexagonal, or not cubes. That's actually not characteristic of the groups, and they don't look like skin that's been carved up and then left on the animal, like somebody's going to put a nice rub on it and then cook it. That's not what scales look like on anything. Not to make fun of the artist here, but this is a particularly bad version of scales on the animal. Maybe the only place that the scales are closer is down by the feet. Also, this animal has, for some reason, the openings in its skull, the fenestra, actually has skin sucked into it, like there's a vacuum inside the skull, which is not what fenestra are for, not to make like cool pockets for tattooing or piercings. That is not right. Like, you have lots of fenestra in your skull, but you don't have skin sucked into your head, right? That's not the point of fenestra. You don't see that in lizards. They have many of the same openings. You don't see it in crocodiles or alligators, right? So when you see things like this, be aware that that's the sort of weirdness associated with, oh, there's openings here, therefore skin should be pulled in if I draw it tight. But that's not really reflective of the way that the animal would have its skin layered in real life to any real degree. And here the eye is really sunken into that socket, so I guess this guy is really sick. The artist has also added a bunch of little spiny nodules to the back of the skeleton, or back of the skin. That is, again, reflective of more of an understanding of them being a reptile. Maybe they, in fact, do have that, but that is something we would expect to see in groups that we call reptiles, right? That is something like an iguana would have. This is, in fact, the reconstruction that the Paul Serena, who works a lot on these as well, offered up as a potential for a more realistic view of these animals. And here there's a couple of things different. One is the scales here are much smaller, obviously, than the prior one, which is probably reflective. You've seen dinosaur skin now a number of times, and in those cases, scales, even on large animals, are still relatively small. The other thing about them is the shape. Dinosaur scales are classically hexagonal in shape, and unless they are protecting an area, in which case they become more longitudinal to help provide more protection for that. Think about the front scales on a chicken leg. But otherwise, they tend to be actually hexagonal in shape. And that's what he's got down here. You can see that it's not like they're a perfect hexagons like a beehive, but they're roughly hexagonal in shape in that way. And he also has this little fringe of flare on the back of this guy. But you can also see that the head doesn't have these weird sucked-in indentations. And then the appearance of the color is, again, speculative here because we don't necessarily know. It's not necessarily right or wrong in any one direction, but it is at least a guess at what these guys may have looked like just based on some relationship to, let's say, birds. Now, we do need to be careful because this again, I showed you a prior picture of an ornithischian with feather structures, right, very primitive feathers on it. This is very much more closely related to the group that we know has feathers, and it doesn't have feathers on it. So which is right in that way? We need to start to think about that as well. Here are the actual scales of a dinosaur, right? This actually is skin of a dinosaur, and if you look at these scales proper to convince you that they're hexagons, they do roughly form these, these hexagonal-like shapes. So that came from a hadrosaur. This is also a hadrosaur, right? This is a large animal. And that animal would be covered in those scales. Keep in mind, scales on the body of an animal will be different in different locations. Scales prevent flexibility, so the larger and thicker the scale, the less flexibility you have, but the more protective surface that offers. So you can think if you're looking at a dinosaur where you would need little flexibility, you would expect to have large blocking scales. Where you need lots of flexibility in the arm joints for animals that do a lot of movement with their arms, and in places like the inside of the groin or on the side of the leg, then you would expect smaller scales. Or in places like the neck, right, which do a lot of twisting, those animals will probably need to have smaller scales to provide the ability to move more completely, right? If you have really thick scales on your neck and you can only turn a little bit, that may not be very useful. It may be useful in some cases, and in some groups we actually know that, right, they gave up the ability to basically maneuver their bodies to any real degree and really focus in on defense. The Ankylosaurs, the Admonosaurids in that way, really do specialize on making these big, thick scales, and that would protect you in the sense that if somebody came and tried to eat you, it would be really hard to penetrate into the soft parts of your body, but it would defeat the ability to do things like move quickly, right? And we saw that with that group. Those are really slow animals. Those are animals that even kids could ride on the back of, probably. This is another group, and this is again another hadrosaur here, Sauropelta. And what you can look at again is that here are some more scales from this animal preserved, or not preserved, but the impressions are left behind. What you can see is there's lots of small ones, and then systematically throughout it, there's a repeating pattern of one large scale. So these would be more like stripes, so a bunch of small scales along the body with occasional large scales running down as well along the body. And that's going to add a visual element to it. Again, not unexpected for these animals, right? Maybe they're different colors, maybe they're not, but maybe they provide some way for animals to know some information about each other. And then this is also, you can see again, very distinctly hexagons, right? These are really clean, actually, as a matter of fact. And this, I think this is in fact a... Oh, I'm going to ask you this. Oh, it's good that I leave these notes to myself. So first let's highlight that these are hexagons, right? So very distinctly hexagons. And then they also, in addition to having these repeating large scales, like you saw in the prior one, these guys actually have really cool knobs that stick out to the side. So just as a guess, does anyone have any idea where these guys come from? What scale impressions these are left from? Go ahead. It's not an Ankylosaur. It's not a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Is it a 3-horn? It is a Ceratopsian. So a Triceratops? This is a Triceratops, actually. So if you were to look at this, is a really nice reconstruction in that way. These would actually, they would have little nobules attached to them, right? So there would be these big, thick, round scales with these little nobules in the midst of them. So there is a little relief on these guys.
What's the purpose then of this large random knobs?
What's the purpose of... Yeah, so now this is a different question, and this becomes harder to understand in that way. It may be a visual cue. It may provide you with some information. It may provide some layer of protection that is unclear, and maybe for something else. I don't have an answer for you. In cases like that where you see something that looks pretty specialized but probably doesn't provide immediate, that's going to help them be more defensible. I would guess you're on the order of visual cues and sexual selection in that way. And then the other place, of course, that we can look, so that's dinosaur, I would say, that's probably the main portion of the body and the tail, what you just saw. So you can imagine dinosaurs covered in scales like that, at least the large animals. If you look at a chicken foot, however, and this is probably very characteristic of dinosaurs, there's a series of large, long, latitudinal scales that are positioned so that they face the direction of the animal's movement. And that provides really strong protection to the front of the foot, which is what you'd want if you're lifting it and bringing it forward through material, especially plant material, right? But it also, in the back, you can see these small scales, and that is where the flexibility is contained, right? So the toe is still able to curl, but it provides you with a really nice sheath around which to protect tendons and bones and whatnot. Obviously, you want to protect. Legs and feet can take damage, but you would prefer if they not constantly need to be repaired because you're walking around on them. And then we've seen this guy already, right? I've shown you pictures from this. This is a nodosaur, and you can just see that again, this is still, in fact, very similar to the style of animal you saw before, but this takes it to an extreme level. And in this case, it's a bunch of little scales, large scales, little scales, large scales, but that's primarily for protective purposes. Same thing here as well, right? So we've seen quite a bit of that. I've also mentioned to you now in a couple of places that dinosaurs, of course, being related to birds, and birds commonly use keratin as a covering to a lot of body materials. This animal, in fact, is what is this? This is, in fact, a toucan. Yep. Hornbill is a guess, but it's actually a toucan. And the thing that's important to note here is looking at just the bones leads to this sort of very weird thing, right? There is a clear bill, but it doesn't, in fact, look like it even meets together. And then there's this weird patch if you had that in a fossil. Let's say it'd be very delicate, so you might not get it. We have a weird patch on top of the head. Well, that's all important location for attaching keratin, right? That provides the protective and the anchoring root for that keratin. And of course, what looks like an open beak in this animal when the keratin sheath is applied is actually a fully sealed beak that actually has a nice nipping component associated with it. So if we think about that in dinosaurs too, because we are going to be dealing with keratin as well, we need to think about that as what and how much is covering the body, which could make a very different appearance within these animals. Whether large amounts of the surface are covered or whether relatively small amounts of the surface are covered. Of course, a lot of the dinosaurs you've already seen have had very noticeable beaks on the front. They would be much larger in life, right? Because there would be an additional sheath of keratin that would surround that. So you can imagine the Triceratops already has a very noticeable beak in front, and then there would, in addition to that, be a keratin beak that would surround it. So it would be really quite large. And of course, keratin comes in lots of colors, but it's often yellow and orangish, although there are there's lots of variation within that, and we can expect to see that. So you might, and we know that animals like ceratopsians probably had keratin that covered, or at least partially covered, their frill, and so you might expect to see very, very attractively colored ceratopsians, and this may be important in the exchange of information, right? It may be really important to be a brightly colored male. That may give your information to your rivals and also information to females. It may be important for a juvenile to be relatively uncolored. That's protection against predators, right, not to draw attention to yourself, but also protection against your same species so that you don't encourage aggression against you, right? It's dangerous to be an underdeveloped male that's displaying strong secondary sexual characteristics because you're constantly going to be attacked by other males. You're displaying as if you are trying to attract females, and that alone is dangerous for them to have you around. Keratin is probably also covering lots of other bony elements that are sticking out. I mentioned you the Stegosaurus, the Thagomizer, right, is probably also covered by really strong and thick keratin, and that's probably making them relatively longer than even that you see in the museum, and also much sharper. And probably also the plates are well covered by keratin. It's probably not as thick, but it probably covers the outside, and again may provide color or relief to that plate in some way. And so the diversity of some of these animals is probably relatively high. And so what we see as, well, these animals are somewhat diverse, may in fact be that much more diverse. And so sexual characteristics and the differences in body shape may not be as pronounced in just the bones themselves. They may also be on the soft parts, which we don't have as much access to. Right, so we may not get as much information. So the question of, well, why aren't dinosaurs just obviously sexually dimorphic when we look at them? Part of the answer is, well, we don't have a lot of specimens in many cases. Part of the answer may be that a lot of that may be stored in soft tissue as well, not just in the hard tissue. The underlying body plan is similar, but a lot of information is stored on top of that, so we just don't get that as much. And the other concept I want you to think about is that the idea of adding lots of colors to dinosaurs, I think as a kid I was discouraged from doing that to the degree that I always wanted to reflect as much of the science as I could. And modern science books at the time really showed dinosaurs as light gray and dark brown and black animals. And that's probably not true. Dinosaurs are probably, or I should say were probably fairly attractively colored in many cases, and probably noticeably so. Many modern groups are fairly attractively colored. Even ones that are cryptic are still fairly attractively colored. Think about sparrows. If you pull out a wing, they actually have a lot of patterning going on. Cardinals, for instance, are actually fairly attractively colored. And those are also attempting to be cryptic. You can think of blue jays. There's a lot of very common groups. Mockingbirds that just use a couple of different colors, but there's a lot of patterning.
You've also said that they probably had some color patterns that we wouldn't be able to see because they
Right.
ultraviolet as well.
So the other thing about, of course, dinosaurs is they see in one more wavelength, and this is a wavelength that you can't see. So you may in fact see what looks like a relatively dull bird, but to the same species it may in fact be fairly well colored. So yeah, so the other important thing, and I think I have this later in the lecture, but the other important thing to keep in mind is there's another wavelength of light, which is being released from, or often is being associated with birds that you can't visualize, that they are using to pattern their bodies. And so just because you think a bird is dull does not guarantee it's dull in the sense that it's not well patterned. In fact, if you turn a UV light on, you might easily see that. You might see that they actually have a lot of patterning in their feathers. So when I say to you, this is what color dinosaurs were, be aware that, yeah, that's a color that your eye detects, but they're also seeing each other in another color that your eye doesn't detect. So imagine that color and then add it. And that is where the difficulty and sometimes understanding these comes in. Also, if you look at sauropods, we actually have a lot of sauropods in many cases we think are relatively straightforward, but there is actually a lot of diversity. Here's a good example of an animal with lots of different stuff going on all along the body. This artist has reconstructed it where what looks like armor is a relatively dull color, and then the body itself is probably more colored. That seems like a fine understanding of what the two purposes of those things could be. But it may also be that color is added to the armor as well. When you get to some large size, you may not care to some degree. But you can see there's a lot of differences even along the body. But also look, these spines along the back, at least in some groups we do know they existed, and so that patterning applied to other animals also seems reasonable. So that iguana-like appearance to some dinosaurs may be a fair representation of what they actually look like. Here's an animal that we don't really understand very well. It seems to have really long spine extensions along the vertebral column, and it's really hard to understand what is actually going on here. Are they used in the sense that they have skin between them and there's color applied to them, and they're probably in that way used for sexual selection? Are they not? Are they used to break up the outline of the animal? Do these extremely long extensions back here also have color and pattern along them? So these kind of animals, the ones that are slightly unusual, become really difficult to guess at because it is really hard to imagine what these animals might look like. So this is a reconstruction with the skin actually intact, and here's a reconstruction with the skin removed, right? Which is correct? We don't know. We don't actually know, and what you would need to do is get really lucky and find skin preserved between vertebral elements to note if that were in fact the case, but you can imagine that's very difficult. If there is skin between them, does it go all the way up? Does it come part of the way up? Does it have keratin sheets on the outside of it? So there's a lot of questions you might ask about animals like this. We already talked about this guy quite a bit. This is yet another fossil, but the patterning and color of this animal now we actually have somewhat of an understanding of potentially, and you saw that it was patterned in a similar way to modern birds to a degree, right? There was some similarity in that. You wouldn't necessarily mistake this for a modern bird personally because of the huge long tail that would come off the end and the tiny little teeth, but you would understand the color pattern at least to a degree. Oh, and this is the refresher about where that sits in the timetable. The important thing here is that at this time, so at about 150 million years ago, feathers have evolved, right? And asymmetrical feathers have evolved. So the most derived version of feathers now appear within the fossil record. So that means, for all intents and purposes, that feathers must have evolved much, much earlier for us to suddenly have very derived feathers within the fossil record. So we should expect to see in Triassic and Jurassic rocks progressively more primitive feathers as we go back in time, right? And the primitive feathers should look very different. So people started to make predictions about, well, what would primitive feathers look like? Modern feathers are fairly complex things. I warned you about this. There's barbules that actually help hold the feathers together, but they're actually off of a main rachis, which also have barbules coming out of these barbs that come out of them, and they have barbs on them, right? So it's a repeating structure that comes out from a central portion. Well, let's remove the barbules, right? So then let's just have a primitive secondary feather where the elements coming out from the rachis do not inherently want to stick to one another. They don't have that Velcro-like strap that sometimes people describe feathers as having, right? So if you pull a feather apart, if you take your fingers and zip along it again, it will seal back up. That's because it's basically a Velcro system that pulls back together. So they should look something like this. Or maybe the alternative is true. Is maybe out of the raucous there are just a few elements that come out and they have barbules. They don't overlap per se, but they provide really strong insulation. And a more primitive version of that would be no raucous, just those barb elements coming out of the top of the root. And then an even simpler element would be just a single shaft coming out from the body itself, growing straight out from the integument. Right? And so these are the system under which we started to look for feathers. We should expect to see in very old rocks single filament feathers covering part of the bodies, and in younger rocks we should see more and more advanced feathers, reaching until the point where we get a very highly combined asymmetrical flight feather, right? A very, very different structure. For a few years, that seemed to work out fairly well. We spent all of our time in the theropods. We seemed to have a very simple explanation. You had shafted feathers up at the very, very derived theropods, and especially close to the birds. Not surprising. If you know anything about, okay, so this is Velociraptors, and you can see that there are shafted feathers there, so you can think of those basically as bird feathers, but instead of being asymmetrical, they are symmetrical all the way down. And then you see that we get less and less into more and more hair-like feathers as we go down the tree, right? Which makes sense. Okay, and that seems to be restricted pretty clearly within the theropods. Tyrannosaurs do appear to have that. But there were some real problems with this. One is that the ornithischians turned out to have also shafted feathers like the dromaeosaurs. So ornithischian arms probably had shafted feathers all along them, and that was probably a display function, and that seems to have been characteristic of adults. So we think it is about sexual display and not about some other function. Juveniles don't appear to have those. They just appear to have a layer of basically down all along the body, which would make them look like sort of weird puffy turkey things. And then they would have had a tail that comes out. And that was probably an insulation feature that helped them keep body temperatures up. But if they have shafted feathers, and we don't think these two groups have shafted feathers that sit between them, that would mean that feathers actually have evolved, that shafted feather has evolved multiple times, or that our understanding about feathers is very weak. So that was confusing enough. And then this animal was found. And this is, of course, a Psittacosaurus. This belongs to what group of animals? Yep, this is a very primitive ceratopsian. It's sort of hard to see. The animal is crushed and rotated to the side. But this animal does have those characteristic large knobs that come out of the side of the face, right? Nipping beak. And then this fossil was found, there are very distinctly long elements that come out of the tail. And those look a lot like what we call those type 1 feathers. And if there are type 1 feathers outside of the theropods now, then that would suggest that all dinosaurs would potentially have had exposure or access to feathers to some degree. And so that was a little bit confusing. Now, it's also possible, right, that Psittacosaurus is evolved in a structure like that independently, that these aren't feathers in that way, and that they're a separate structure that looks similar to what we'd expect a type 1 feather to be, and that they just happen to look like that in the fossil record. And so the solution obviously there is very easy. You just get little tiny juvenile Psittacosaurus and you raise them in the lab and find out if they grow with standard feather development genes and in the same way. Unfortunately, you obviously cannot do that. So we have to keep looking. And what ended up happening was that we continued to find small integument extensions from the body of ornithischians. Right, here's another one. Here's one where there's a base plate and then a bunch of little tiny extensions off of it. Right, little tiny what look like type 1 feathers. And this is also a very primitive ornithischian, not dissimilar from the first one I showed you. And in this case, the animal we know was covered from the head to just the base of the tail, and then the legs were also exposed. Right, and the tail actually looks fairly armored in this animal, as a matter of fact. But this animal would have been a little hairy guy, right? Hair in the sense, I'm using hair here, it's not true hair. But it would have looked hairy because they are these long single extensions that come away from the body. And here the artist has drawn it as, again, a brownish, a dullish color. We don't know that, right? Now we've got some real questions to discuss about things like that. Feathers offer you a lot of opportunities to add color and change the appearance of the animal very readily. But if this ornithischian, so does that suggest that ornithischians as a whole evolved from a primitive ancestor that were covered in primitive feather-like extensions? Well, that is a bit of a troublesome thing. If ornithischians and saurischians both have feathers, then their common ancestor would also have had feathers, right? We don't expect that feather to have evolved twice in these animals. If they both have feathers, that suggests that an animal, the common ancestor to all dinosaurs, had feathers. But at what point then did feathers evolve? So we know roughly when dinosaurs appear on the face of the earth. But if we are saying, well, we are suspecting now that the common ancestor has feathers, then that means probably groups outside of dinosaurs also had feathers. So where do we stop on that change? And then an important question that we also want to know then is, then why did feathers evolve? Why possibly would you have feathers? So you've seen this now many, many times. We know that at least up here there are feathers where I put this tiny little red bar you probably can't see. We know also where I'm putting all these red bars that these groups now had feathers, right? So we can keep going backwards. And now we think these guys had feathers and these guys had feathers, which means that we'd have to go backwards from here, and that would mean that we would fall outside of the Dinosauria. Well, that's fine. It's fine to know that animals outside Dinosauria had feathers. We do have all the Dinosauromorphs to deal with as well, but all we need now to find out where feathers are located within the tree is just find a common ancestor that doesn't have feathers. And so the nearest ancestor we've used over and over again so far that's extinct has been the pterosaurs, and then if we want a living member, we have to go to the crocodiles. So let's just look at the pterosaurs, right? We can figure out what's going on. Well, Dinosauromorphs, unfortunately, we don't have access to in a real way because they are just so rare. We don't have very many to deal with. But pterosaurs we actually know quite a bit about. And if you remember back to when I talked about pterosaurs, I warned you that pterosaurs have this element on their body called pycnofibres, which look a lot like type 1 feathers, which means it could be type 1 feathers. So when did type 1 feathers evolve? Well, that's not clear, but pterosaurs probably look really hairy, and that's probably characteristic of these primitive dinosauromorphs and dinosaurs. They probably look like these little hairy things that run around in the forest, right? Hairy reptiles. So if you had been there and you had looked at these things, you would have said, that is very weird, and that is not like what I see, right? And that makes sense. You're really starting to approach these junction points where groups are becoming derived, and they're picking up a lot of characteristics, but on the way, they're dragging through all these primitive conditions with them, and these primitive conditions are the things that you're identifying other groups as. Oh, these primitive conditions mean that they're reptiles. They're scaly, therefore they're reptiles. Well, that is really not a primitive condition in the sense that it's not sufficient to provide us enough information to group things, right? Primitive mammal-like animals, right, would have been scaly. They would have been what you called a reptile. So we need more features in that. And so pterosaurs have these really nice pycnofibres on them as well, and they were probably also colored to a degree. This guy over here actually probably filled the same niche space as bats, and so it actually probably wasn't colored. This was actually probably a fairly good reconstruction of how feathers might have looked on that animal. They're real small. They have big eyeballs, so they probably flew around real close to dawn and dusk to eat insects. They're pretty neat. They're real cute, and they probably all the fossils we have, they're like crouched in real tight, so they probably landed on trees and like tried to look like a little tree knob for most of the day, crouched in real tight, and then occasionally got eaten off. Okay, so that means that if pterosaurs have something like a feather, which may be a feather, we don't know yet, but we can at least say, well, let's just go backwards one more step. Let's just find out what's going on. Well, let's go look at crocodiles. That's very easy. Crocodiles don't have feathers. That turns out to be true. Crocodiles and alligators do not actually have feathers, but they do have at least, they share a gene that's involved in building feathers in their genome. So they don't express it, but they have at least a gene that produces a feather, part of the feather in the genome. So that suggests that their primitive ancestor of that group actually also had feathers or something feather-like to a degree within that, which means that archosaurs are probably defined by having evolved feathers partially. That may in fact be part of what makes an archosaur an archosaur. So now that we may want to say we shouldn't be surprised that alligators necessarily have feather genes, but we should maybe say, why did they lose access to those genes? What did they give up? Does that help explain how feathers might have evolved? And so that means that if you have these branch points, right, all saying, well, there's feathers involved, then you're probably dealing with a primitive archosaur containing some feather-like element. Now, it doesn't mean that that primitive archosaur would have looked like a chicken. That's not what it means. Remember, feathers are going to evolve from a small component of the body and extend out, because you're not going to be, one day it's a reptile, next day you snap your fingers, the little egg hatches, and it's just this roly-poly, cute, fluffy dude. That's not going to happen. You're going to look a lot like your parent, right? By default, whether you like it or not, you're going to look like mom and dad. If you don't like that, I guess don't have kids. So if your parent looks a lot like a reptile, you're going to add feathers as small elements slowly, not all at once. So when did feathers evolve? So you know that dinosaurs at least had scales to some degree. I've shown you that in the lecture. But I've also warned you now that many of them, if not all, in their genome have access to feather genes. So where do they produce those elements? So why would feathers evolve? Well, one element, so this looks really weird, right? It looks stupid that this dinosaur has a bunch of long feathers on its tail. That's actually because we have fossils that suggest that it had lots of long feathers on its tail like that, in this sort of weird pine cone, turkey-ish thing. But it's like a turkey, but the turkey, instead of having a really abrupt tail and then having a strong feather to back it, has, I guess it makes sense, has a long dinosaur tail, and then at the butt of it has a turkey tail, which I guess makes sense if you draw it a turkey tail. Yeah, it is like a real weird feathery crayfish. These arm feathers are probably very characteristic of many theropods groups that would have long, symmetrical arm feathers that would not be dissimilar in appearance from some flight feathers on them. So if feathers evolved, so maybe they evolved for display. That's hard to understand, because how could you display with one little tiny thin feather on the body, or just a couple, right? Assuming that a genome produces a very small initial group of feathers somewhere. So that seems hard to understand. Insulation, right? Feathers are very, very good at insulation. You know that because you wear coats often made with bird feather, or you might have sheets or pillows with bird feather in it. When, of course, sparrows, they don't die during the winter, even though they're standing outside and it's really cold, so you know that bird feathers work really well as insulation. Well, that also seems to be a failed explanation for feathers, because if you only have a couple of very small, thin, wispy feathers, that's not going to insulate you. And primitive archosaurs are not endothermic, so they don't regulate heat by retaining heat with another element. Crocodiles actually, large ones, are actually fairly stable in temperature, and we'll talk about this. But they regulate heat by actually moving between environments, right? So they don't use feathers in that sense. That almost without doubt guarantees that any form of flight, gliding, all of that, feathers cannot have evolved at all for that function. You don't get birds because a lot of dinosaurs are jumping out of trees for a long time, and then some of them finally managed to make big flight feathers that took them further. No. You get birds because you had all of the feather elements in place, and then it just so happened that by making one of the feathers slightly asymmetrical, you got really nice glides out of it, or really nice flapping power out of that. This is an old one too. I just liked it because it's a little ridiculous. It also tried to explain how birds evolve flight. This is the bug catcher hypothesis, where the arms actually become feathered so they can herd bugs. It looks a little bit ridiculous now, but it is kind of funny. So the current hypothesis we have for why feathers evolved is actually for the reason that many birds currently use them in small elements around the face, and that's for the detection of area right in close to the eyes and to the mouth. And these are all modern day birds that use these feathers to do that, so effectively as whiskers. And then over here on the right, what a theropod might have looked like, or I should say, a Dinosauromorpha, or some animal like a dinosaur would have looked like, with feathery structures just around the face, right? And maybe that does provide, maybe these animals, the animals that evolved them are hunting in burrows and hunting out things like mammal-like rodent things, and need to feel around in the burrow, right, when they can't see very well. And so feather-like elements would work really, really well in that case, where you can't rely on eyesight necessarily for some information. You can use a tactile sense in that way. So maybe feathers evolved that way. So maybe crocodiles and alligators, in fact, do have, yes, a gene for feathers, but maybe they would have been localized to the face in that sense for these groups. But modern feathers are, of course, very complex relative to that. So when I'm talking about primitive feathers and what primitive dinosaurs may have had, we're talking about single elements, single stretches that would have looked a lot more like thick hairs than they would have looked like what you think of when you think of a feather in that way. And of course, these are some of our most advanced feathers. What is that? It's a National Geographic picture of a bird feather. You mean what species does it come from? I don't remember off the top of my head. Might be. And then, of course, the theropods themselves. So when we're talking about dinosaurs now, we really do have to question, are dinosaurs feathered or not, and which members are. And that is not entirely clear. We don't seem to know the answer to that. For the theropods, however, we are more comfortable in stating theropods are going to have a lot of feathers, and in any group closely associated with birds, they're going to look a lot like a bird. It's not that birds are that different from other theropods. It's that other theropods are that similar to birds, right? It's that way. It's not the other way. And so if you look at things like Eoraptor, which would have been more closely related to modern-day birds, it probably looks to a degree like a modern bird. So the new Jurassic Park videos that are not videos, movies that are showing theropods as really being naked, large, scaly reptiles are very much wrong, right? That they really should look like feathery animals. Actually, this came up when the new Jurassic Park movie was being developed. It turned out when audiences viewed them, they said they just look like big turkeys. And it's not really that scary. Like, it's just a big turkey. You just want to, like, all right, that's enough. You look a little dangerous, but seriously. So the idea of dinosaurs, right, as more of a, and this maybe helps us explain how we don't understand birds and dinosaurs as being absolutely the same thing. When you suddenly say, well, there's a bird, look how different it is, look at all the feathers, and here's a reptile thingy that runs around. Why would that be at all related? Well, in fact, they do look a lot like them. It's just that this one has asymmetrical feathers and it flies, and this one doesn't have asymmetrical feathers and it runs. And that's really the difference in maybe appearance. Here the colors are speculative again, but I'd really encourage you to think about, wow, if feathers really do add an element of color to modern day birds, think about how diverse in appearance dinosaurs would be. And especially as you think about theropods, just think about the diversity in those bodies and what they would have looked like to one another. Okay, so just as a quick recap here, most, if not all, theropods, as far as we know, have some element of feathers. Now, it's not going to be, again, it's not going to be that bird feather, but it probably at least is a type 1 feather. That doesn't mean they had it all their lives. They could have had it as a chick and then lost it. You don't want to have lots of feathers as a big T-Rex. That actually would be really bad. You would cook yourself. Feathers are good at insulating, and if you get lots of feathers on you and you're huge, you would literally just roast under them. They might have had whiskers, but for some, if you're dealing with animals that are hunting large prey items, you probably don't need those as much. But for smaller animals, maybe, especially animals that may be shoving their heads into crevices to pull things out, then you would expect that, very much so. Things like Spinosaurs, however, because they look like crocodiles and alligators, you wouldn't expect that, right? Because a whisker-like thing underwater is not as effective. They have to either be really, really stout, like otters, or really short in that way to provide you with information. And then, of course, we have plenty of modern-day theropods to guess at color. So bird diversity, if anything, is probably less than, in color choice, less than all dinosaur groups, right? We wouldn't expect the birds to have come through with every color option, every color palette that was available to dinosaurs. Oh, and then this last piece, I put this up and I didn't even look away, and now it suddenly appeared, and I was like, I don't think I had anything to the screen. And then the other thing that I think people have said for a long time is you can't know the color of fossils, it's impossible. Well, that's not true. You can, in fact, know the color of fossils, just certain. So this is another theropod, and this, in fact, is reconstructed in the color patterning that we think it had in real life. And the way to actually go about knowing that is we have the feathers for this animal, and within the feathers, of course, there are pigmented cells, right? These cells that make pigment within them. And those pigment shapes are very distinctive of certain colors. And so you can actually go in and measure them and take 3D imaging of them and then predict based on where you sample the feather what each color would have been in the prior animal. And this is the patterning that you reconstruct for this guy, right? This came out in Nature just a few years ago, and I think it's quite cool in the sense that it looks like a modern-day bird quite a bit. But it also has a lot of fun additional aspects to it. So is it colorful? Yeah, it's fairly colorful. It also seems to be crying blood. But it also has a very distinct patterning on the wing that you're comfortable with, right? This looks like a bird wing, but it's not a wing. It's not functioning in the same way in many cases. You like the crest? Yeah, kind of like, yeah, exactly. This is another animal that was examined. So this is Microraptor, examined in a very similar way. You can see that this animal is something of a, not, when I say flyer here, don't think of a really long endurance flyer. Think of an animal that's jumping from twig to twig, maybe to a degree. And when you reconstruct that color, then it looks like a crow, right? Pretty, I'm sorry.
Ruining it.
But it looks like a dark-bodied bird, and it's not dissimilar in appearance from what modern groups look like, right? This is very close to some patterning we see in modern-day groups, and that suggests that that convergence is not surprising in that way. The difference here, and it may have in fact perched like a modern-day crow or a raven on these trees, right? That you would have had animals really perching. But it would have looked unusual to you because it would have had a very long tail, right, that would have hung off the back here with a little tuft of feathers at the end, and then it would have had what looked like these weird vertical wings off of the legs in that way. And so this is a good example of maybe how that functions within the animal. This is another animal. It's a Sinosauropteryx. Very clearly from the fossil, you can already tell that there's banding on the tail. Right, so clearly there's some banding on this animal already, and this was also examined in a similar way, and it looked like that, or something like that. This orangish, reddish material, and it had these bands along the tail, and it was probably using those in a function to display between conspecies, right? Just imagine a situation, something like this, where these animals are displaying one. Actually, this is not terribly unsurprising. This is not dissimilar from how birds display to one another, right? This isn't exactly how they do it, but this gives you an idea of some of the diversity that's within that, and also, early Macarenas, and the idea that, well, you know that parts of it are scaly, and we can reconstruct that, but part of it is also feathery, and that looks very different to a degree. But again, this idea that theropods are really, really different from birds, no, birds are really, really similar to theropods because they are, but some theropods less so than the birds that we think of. And then this is not immediately related to dinosaurs, but the modern day, this is also done for extinct aquatic reptiles, and they turn out to look like all other giant modern day reptiles, which is the leatherback turtles, a very dark-bodied with a light underside, and guess what? Your extinct giant marine reptiles were very dark-bodied, often with a light underside. Except for this Ichthyosaurus, which is apparently completely black. No, but I think there's some differences with Ichthyosaurus, but that looks very similar to the modern day groups that we know of that deal in the aquatic realm, and that's probably convergent in that way. So the appearance of these guys is better known. So here's this old view of Velociraptor. It's wrong, and of course all of our views are wrong, but this one is more wrong now, and that is because it looks naked. It looks like a plucked turkey. If you are looking at dinosaurs now, you should expect to see feathers to some degree, especially on these small-bodied animals. Remember, Velociraptor in the movies is really big. There are dromaeosaurs that large, and that would be something like a Utah raptor. Velociraptors, though, you're thinking small. You're thinking puntable, right? These are not. You're going to get rid of them if they come after you. These animals are these are the plucked Velociraptor. Probably a more realistic picture of them would be something like this, right? Yeah, so much cuter, less intimidating. You would pet it, but it would bite you. That kind of thing. But it's carrying through a lot of the elements that we were thinking about before. It's got that tuft of feathers at the end that was probably used for display. It's got very long feathers on the arms, which probably cover most of the side of the body from the profile there. It's also got feathers that probably cover most of the head, but probably not the very extension of the head, because that's probably where the animals accessing wet materials like meat, and you don't want to get your feathers bloodied, so it probably doesn't have feathers all the way to the end. And then the legs are probably well covered down to pretty close to the ground, but then again, at the ground you would expect to see basically a chicken leg, right? That's what you should expect to see there, except in this chicken leg, instead of having all three forward toes pointing front, the one is pulled up and back and away, right? Because we know that from the footprint. So now we're really starting to add a lot of these elements, and we're getting relatively reasonable guesses at what these probably look like. The color, again, is speculative here because we don't know what the color of these animals would be. You can guess lots of different stuff, and I think it would probably be fun to come up with lots of different things. And then we already talked about this guy, but I just want to point out that the hand is also held close into the body like a bird, where there's that swivel already in place that allows them to bend their wrist in tight to fold their arm in underneath. So Velociraptors, when they are running, or when they were running, would probably fold those arms in close and lay them up close against the body. The feathers would have looked very similar but short to what a modern bird does when it looks like it's running with the arms in tight against the body. I can't do it. I can't break my arm, so I'm not going to. So the holding of that finger, right, is very characteristic, and so the holding of the arm on birds where it looks like this really weirdly folded thing, but when it folds out, it does it very cleanly, and then when it folds back in, it pulls everything in very nice, would have been already in place in many theropod groups. So the long feathers of the arm, the folding of those evolved long before birds evolved flight. And then I think that there is some reason why on this day I was adding a lot of chicken stuff, but in any case, this also is inherently true now. So if someone asks you what would a dinosaur taste like, you would say it tastes like a chicken because they are. Therefore, that is the taste of a dinosaur. Paleognathans are, we're not going to talk about them very much right now. I just want to introduce them as an idea. This is a primitive group of modern aves, and of course Paleognathans, the ones that you're thinking that are commonly thought about, things like ostriches, are not terribly exciting in color, but some of them, like the cassowary, are in fact really exciting in color, right? And not just the body. The body itself is this very dark feathers that look like type 1 feathers. They're not in fact type 1 feathers. They're modified flight feathers. But they function and they look like what type 1 feathers would have looked like, which is actually fairly interesting. But the neck is exposed probably to give flexibility, and then in addition to that, the neck is really, really well colored, and that may be really important in signaling between individuals. And also you have to be really careful of these guys because they do kill people. So just so you know, and they also, just like you would expect, they actually jump in the air and kick you with their feet. So the idea of the Velociraptor jumping in the air and kicking things with his feet, they still do it, so just be aware. It's probably not that different from the way it's done. And then there's also this bird. This is Hoatzin, or the stink bird. And what's really fun about these guys is that they retain the claws on the chicks of the early fingers, and then eventually the claws fall off.
I saw those ones at the Amazon. They call them stinky turkeys.
Yeah, stinky. Yeah, people apparently don't like. Yeah.
Since they ferment food, they kind of smell like manure.
That's correct. Yes. So that's how I've heard it described. Sorry, I'll let the birds know. The very distinct hand of the theropod is also present on these guys, and if you have the chicks, you would see that very quickly. Okay, so that'll wrap up this lecture on the appearance of dinosaurs. But I want you to reconsider when you see things like theropods chasing each other, they may in fact look something like this, right? A Velociraptor would look like sort of a weird bird turkey thing with a long tail, and the things it's chasing may look like something like a chicken or pretty close to it to a degree, right? So dinosaurs are going to be fairly varied in appearance, and they probably do have feathers to some element of their body in many cases. Maybe not the largest, but probably many of the small ones do.